Welcome to Face the Nation. I'm Leslie Stahl. Nearly half of this year's college seniors will be part of a new generation, the debtor generation. These days, college graduates start on their careers already heavily burdened with debt on their student loans. And the new Reagan budget, according to critics, exacerbates the problem. Student borrowing has nearly tripled in the last 10 years, while federal grants and scholarships have declined 62%. A recent government report raised concern that debt would overburden a full generation.
I am indebted to the amount of $5,000 and some odd dollars when, by the time I finish paying on a payment schedule of $63 a month for 120 months, it will be about $7,000.
The president is asking Congress to reduce the education budget by $5 billion, with the largest cuts in college aid, including Pell Grant scholarships for the needy and guaranteed student loans. The only increase for loans with no federal subsidies that must be repaid in full. The idea got a chilly response in the Senate.
Your budget cuts education funding overall by some 30%. I wonder where we're going to get the engineers and the science-minded people to keep building for our future.
The administration contends that student aid has been a cause of the skyrocketing costs of college education.
Trying to control college costs merely by increasing aid is like the dog chasing his tail around the tree. The faster he runs, the faster the tail runs away.
The new budget, with its domestic cuts and increases in defense and foreign aid, is facing just as much hostility from Republicans as from Democrats.
I don't think the budget itself has a prayer.
Is the government spending too much or too little on education? We'll ask White House Budget Director James Miller, Senator Robert Stafford, Republican of Vermont, and the president of New York University, John Brademas. Paying for college education, an issue facing the nation.
From CBS News, Washington, Face the Nation, with National Affairs correspondent Leslie Stahl. Face the Nation is sponsored by General Motors, the GM Odyssey, science, not fiction, leading the way to the 21st century.
Is imagination the seed of technology, the inspiration for creating the future? At General Motors, they believe it is. And it's this future they're looking to for today's ideas. In this film, we'll be taking a closer look at the dreamers, thinkers, inventors of GM, working together to develop the revolutionary technology we'll need to take us from today into the 21st century. Reaching, it's fantastic. But is it science or is it fiction? Cut! All right, you set up the close-up of the door and... Yes?
I'm Russell.
Russell, you're taking me to the ABC room.
Yeah, it's over this way. Oh, listen, what do you think of my tie?
I hate it.
Huh?
Come on, I was only kidding. I'm just going to ask you some questions. So, how long have you been with GM?
Joining us now is Budget Director James Miller. Welcome to Face the Nation.
Good to be here.
About 3 months ago in October, President Reagan signed the Higher Education Act, which re-emphasized the federal commitment to send American students to college. Now he has submitted a budget, and as I say, it's only 3 months later, that is trying to cut the higher education funding by 50%. Why this sudden shift?
Well, let me say, for one thing, the cost would go down because the interest rates are going down. That's one reason the cost is going down. The second thing is we're going to give less subsidies to banks for giving these guaranteed loans, the loans that the federal government is guaranteeing. Thirdly, we're going to have the recipients of the higher incomes, mainly the students, pay a little higher proportion of the federal largesse, return it by paying off the loans and paying a little higher fees to cover the very large defaults that we've been experiencing. But on the other hand, we're going to also do a better job about collecting the loans that are due from doctors and lawyers and government bureaucrats as well.
Well, you've been doing that anyway, right?
Well, we've been doing that. We're going to do a better job even next year. But let me just say, we are expanding that portion of the loans where they're income contingent, that is, where students can pay in relationship to their income.
Well, let's make it clear to the audience what we're talking about, because I think we've jumped in the middle of the story. You're cutting the entire higher education budget by 50%. part of that is taking away subsidies for student loans. And you're going to ask everybody who has a loan to pay at the regular interest rate, which students have not been doing traditionally. And the concern, I think, as I understand it, is that kids who are already in debt are going to be more in debt. And the poorer kids are going to end up having to pay more.
Well, the poor kids won't. I mean, we cut down on the Pell Grants somewhat, but we don't eliminate the Pell Grants. But we expand dramatically this income contingent program.
Well, explain what you're talking about. I think all
Okay.
these words are hard for the public to... Pell Grants, contingent...
A student goes in and he borrows money under the income contingent loan portion. If, when he finishes school, he doesn't make very high income, his stream of paybacks can be stretched over a longer period of time.
But he still has his whole life then, or whatever, with this debt. Is there no concern that you're increasing this burden that's already a problem, has already been identified by the government as a serious problem for the future? Kids leaving school, having to pay, as we heard, $7,000, some $9,000 for 4 years education?
Leslie, I say there's no such thing as a free lunch. The cost of higher education has got to be borne by someone. Now, what we're talking about and the changes that are in the budget would save taxpayers $2.4 billion, and that ain't peanuts. Let me say also, a lot of people out there that have gone to college and have paid their way or had parents help their way. The real problem that we have in higher education is that the student cannot use his own self as collateral, cannot use his own human capital as collateral. I once tried to borrow money to go to college and was turned down because I didn't have any collateral. What the government will do under this program is make sure that anyone who wants to go to college can borrow the money to go to college. And in fact, we're lifting the lid off of the maximum amounts that we've had in the past.
But you are taking away a lot of the scholarships, and you're taking away a lot of the subsidized loans. You're going to make it so that people will have to pay more after they leave college. And the federal government's commitment to send American students to college really is moving in the other direction.
I wouldn't characterize it that way. The amount of support out there, the amount of borrowing and direct grants will be just about the same this year as last year. The question is whether, at the margin, whether it should be borne by taxpayers or it should be borne by the students themselves. But also we're going to get these savings in reducing the subsidies to banks and to others.
All right, we're going to be debating this issue later in the broadcast. Let me ask you some other questions about the budget. First, the president, in a similar, what I see as a shift from what he did just a few months ago, is now trying to cut the drug program. He made a big commitment to the drug program. Now he not only wants to cut drug education funds, but also drug enforcement funds. Now, why is he doing that?
Well, the whole drug enforcement and reducing abuse was a $1 billion program in 1981. It was a $2 billion program in 1986, and the president said we need to put more resources there, and he proposed a $3 billion program. Congress, in a frenzy of election year politics, it seems to me, made it a $4 billion program. What we're doing is going back to the $3 billion that the president indicated that he thought could be usefully spent.
Does he think that we're winning the battle and therefore can let up?
Oh, no. $3 billion is not a paltry sum.
Yeah, but it's
and
less.
I think it's less. Suppose that you started with $10 billion and made it $3 billion. You could still have a cutback. The point is that I think that we're going to be able to use that $3 billion very effectively in the war on drugs.
Why is he reducing it when the problem, as he identified it 3 months ago, was worthy of a war?
Well, it was an increase from $2 billion to $3 billion. And the question is whether that extra increase to $4 billion was really, could be effectively used, and we don't think it can be. We have not lessened our aggressiveness toward winning the war on drugs.
Mr. Miller, you know, there's a problem in, I think, you kind of selling this. How can the president go out and say we have such a critical issue as drug abuse in this country, that we need a war, and 3 months later he cuts the budget by a quarter?
Look, the war that we need to win, the soldiers that we need in that war, are not soldiers that are paid by money, but soldiers' families, people who will say no, as the First Lady said. He did not increase the budget. He recommended $3 billion, and Congress gave him $4 billion.
I still don't understand how it's a war and you try to cut, and you want to cut back on the money.
I think just as we've experienced over the last 20 years, putting money on a problem doesn't necessarily solve it. I think what we have to emphasize is people being responsible for themselves. As the First Lady says, say no. and education. Those are the kinds of programs that I think that are going to have the greatest effectiveness.
All right, let me ask you one final before we take a break. Taxes. Why is the president refusing to meet with Congress to have a summit just because he's worried they might bring up taxes?
Well, the president has indicated very specifically he will not go along with a tax increase. Now, some of the invitations for a summit meeting have suggested, well, the president has to put taxes on the table. Well, he's not going to do that.
Well, you have taxes in your budget.
We don't call them taxes. There are no across-the-board tax increases. Leslie, I just disagree with you. They're not
Treasury Secretary Jim Baker called them taxes.
He said that only because technically they come in the top line on the revenue side on the budget. But I think we've got to see what the Congress can come up with. But we will continue to talk with them, and you know, we wouldn't rule out completely some kind of summit, provided the president wasn't forced into some kind of tax increase or some other budget matter that he simply couldn't accept.
Why wouldn't he agree to discuss it with them? What's wrong with the discussion?
Well, right now, as I've indicated, I think that's a possibility, but I think it's a bit premature. We have met the Grand Rubin deficit targets of 108 Grand Rubin Hollings, and we'd like to see how the Democrats on the Hill would come up and do the same thing.
Very quickly, assuming Congress is going to pass the Clean Water Bill and pass it quickly, will the president veto it again?
He has indicated clearly that he would do so.
Okay, let's take a break and come back and talk some more about higher education. We'll be right back.
Kevin, what do you think you're doing, young man?
It's a car.
Well, I bet everyone would just love to see it, wouldn't they? Up front. Go on.
It's long and low like this. And the engine is back here. And?
Does it have a name?
Well, I was kind of thinking of...
Wildcat.
Wildcat?
That's what it's called.
And you say a computer helped design it?
Using computers, our design team can get people the kind of GM cars they want much faster.
Do you have a name for it?
Well, I was kind of thinking of Wildcat.
The GM Odyssey. Science, not fiction.
We've always been concerned about safety here at GM.
What are you doing about designing safer cars now?
Well, there's collision avoidance. It's a radar warning system that might be possible down the road. Also working on something called night vision.
How does it work?
By infrared.
Tom! Is he all right?
He's all right. He's all right.
The GM Odyssey. Science, not fiction.
With us now from New York City, John Brademas, president of New York University, and here in Washington, Senator Robert Stafford of Vermont, the ranking Republican on the Senate Education Subcommittee. Let's go first to New York and John Brademas. Dr. Brademas, the administration, as you know, is cutting the scholarship and the Pell Grant programs and the guaranteed student loan programs and shifting the funds over to a new plan where students will be able to borrow, more students will be able to borrow. The administration says this will allow more students to go to college, but they will have to repay those loans in full. What is your reaction to the program?
Well, Leslie, in the first place, I am strongly opposed to the administration's higher education budget, but in respect to the loan program in particular, let me say that the experiment that Congress voted $5 million for last year on this program has really not even begun, and therefore to undertake a $600 million effort now without our knowing whether or not it works is not a very sensible idea. The second point I would make is one you've already referred to. We have increasingly had our young people rely on loans rather than grants. And this administration is pushing even more and more young people into borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. It seems to have an infatuation with borrowing. The problem that a lot of young people are going to be faced with, I think, is becoming indentured servants, as it were. I saw one analysis the other day that showed that if a student borrowed $17,500 for over a period of 4 years, the student under this new proposed program might have to spend between $32,000 and $52,000 in order to repay that loan. There would be great discouragement to many young people to go into professions that are human service professions, such as school teaching, for example, if they had to be so indebted.
Let me ask you to respond to what the Secretary of Education, Mr. Bennett, has been saying, and that is that tuition costs are skyrocketing. And one of the reasons, he says, is because of the student aid, that you college presidents and boards know that as long as the federal government will bail you out, you can raise tuition costs and other costs.
There's no evidence for that whatsoever. As a matter of fact, Terry Hartle of the American Enterprise Institute wrote the other day that between 1970 and 1980, we'd seen an inverse correlation between an increase in student financial aid and tuition increases. At a time when tuition was rising at American universities, federal aid was falling. There's no evidence for that whatsoever.
All right, let's turn to Senator Stafford and ask about the congressional reaction. It seemed to have been quite chilly to the entire education budget as proposed by President Reagan.
Well, I think, Leslie, that the congressional reaction to the higher education proposed budget has been chilly. We have mixed feelings, some favorable as far as the elementary, secondary educational proposed budget is concerned. I think, generally speaking, for myself at least, I'm reasonably satisfied with the elementary, secondary proposals, except that they propose to do away with the vocational education. I think that's an error. When it comes to higher education, the budget is being cut from fiscal year 87 to fiscal year 88 by some $5 billion, from $19.5 billion down to $14 billion. That's a very large cut, and I think it has a very regrettable consequence in terms of the various college assistance programs. That is, it introduces a new year of turbulence into the whole program when parents and administrators and, most important, students won't know really whether the funds will be available for them to go to school or not next year. I'm talking about low-income students. And so I'm very, very deeply disappointed with the higher education budget.
Well, I'd like to ask all three of you to sort of jump in on this one, but what do each of you see the federal role is in sending American students to college? Should the federal government send anyone who wants to go to school to college or not? I mean, it seems that we were on that track.
I'd like to respond to that, if I may. As I conceive the role of the federal government in higher education is to see that the low-income student who otherwise may not have an opportunity to go to college has that opportunity. I think that's important for the nation. We need educated brains in this country if we're to compete internationally. Even if we're to look after our national security, our young people have to have the education to understand how to use the weapons we devise and the implications that result if they do use them.
Will the senator yield?
Certainly.
I think that we ought to take our hats off to Senator Bob Stafford, who's one of the architects of the higher education bill that you spoke of earlier, Leslie, and he's made two very important points here. One is, it is not possible for us to have $300 billion military budgets or to protect the defense, protect the security of our country unless we have educated men and women. Senator Childs, in your opening clip, noted that we have to be able to get engineers and technicians. We're now moving into an increasingly globalized economy where productivity, competitiveness are the watchwords, and that means increased investment in education, in research, in science, and in technology. It's not possible for us to have the economic growth that we need. It's not possible for us to protect the security of our country unless we invest in educated men and women.
Well, Mr. Miller, what is the President's view of the government's responsibility?
Well, I think the responsibility is very clear. We provide for education up through high school, and beyond that, it's a matter of family determination. It's a matter of the child's determination. But we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to go to school if they wish to go to school. But the point about the education, John, we're not talking about drastic reductions in the number of students going to college.
You're talking about a decline of 3 million student awards from 9.4 million to 6.4 million, according to the Department of Education budget.
John,
that is a sharp drop. So how can you possibly justify that statement, Jim?
No, John, let's distinguish between the awards, and by the way, the reduction are the smaller awards, not the larger awards. In fact, the Pell Grant awards that go to the neediest students will actually be larger because of those economies.
You're dropping 1 million grantees, or 1/3 of the present number of Pell grantees from the program under your budget.
And those are the higher income ones.
Well, I think Dr. Brademas is right here. There will be 3 million less awards. Pell Grants are being reduced by $1.2 billion. Guaranteed student loans are being reduced almost by 2/3, from about $3 billion down to $1 billion.
Right.
And in substitution for that, the administration proposes a $600 million expansion of the $5 million trial thing that we started last year, that Senator Pell and I put in at the request of the administration, this experiment to see if the new program might work. We're supposed to reevaluate that in 5 years.
Leslie,
we haven't even had the first year yet.
Mr. Miller.
I think it's very important to distinguish between the total aid available to students, which will not be changed, and the total cost to taxpayers, which will be lower. Now, I think that that's the key. We're going to lower the cost to taxpayers by having banks subsidize less, by collecting more of the loans so we can reduce the default rate, which I think everyone agrees is far too high, and by also having students pay more of the loans themselves.
Jim, there's no evidence whatsoever for your assertion that there will be just as much aid available. I call to your attention the statement made by the Secretary of Education in Mr. Reagan's first term, Terrell Bell, who said in November that public officials who propose serious reductions in budgets for education are unthinkingly abetting an act of national suicide. Now, that's a Utah Republican speaking about what you're up to. That's not John Brademas speaking. And I agree with Mr. Bell, and I strongly support the position that Senator Stafford is taking. Let's take an example of what's going on in the country right now with the problem in Iran. Your budget would completely eliminate all funds for international studies and research. And I remember very well when I was on the National Commission on Student Financial Assistance talking to Secretary of Defense Weinberger, who was then making the point that we needed to invest more in international studies and research so that we could have a better understanding of the peoples with whom we're dealing. You would eliminate all of the money for that.
Well, Leslie, I was never very good at mathematics, but I do understand the fact, and I have to say this to my friend Jim Miller, that if you take $4.5 billion out of the higher education programs with one hand and add $600 million for an experimental program of loans with another, that somehow we've lost $3.9 billion of aid to students who want to go to college. And I think that's bad for the country, bad for the youngsters who want to go.
And Bob, they've also eliminated in this budget all of the money for the college work-study program that you have so strongly supported, which last year they thought was great. This year they think it's awful.
And
Let me ask Jim Miller a question
also
about the tax issue that you raised about the taxpayers. Every poll that comes out on the budget that asks the question, what would you pay higher taxes for? The first item is always education. Do you not feel that the American people want to see that students go to college and feel that the federal government has a role?
Surely, but if you ask taxpayers, would you rather pay $19 billion instead of $14 billion and accomplish the same thing? They'll probably say, I'd rather pay $14 billion.
But they're saying you're not accomplishing the same thing.
I think that by and large we would be accomplishing
Jim, there was only one vote in the United States Senate last year against Bob Stafford's higher education bill.
And of course the president signed it, which makes it doubly disappointing. We're in this sort of situation 3 months later.
Let Jim Miller explain how it's going to be the same thing, because I don't think that's come across yet.
Suppose that you say you're going to spend less money on subsidies for the guaranteed student loan program, and you're going to spend less money in direct grants and tell people to obtain loans. The cost to the taxpayer goes down, but the amount of money available to the student can remain the same. If you're a student, you're concerned about going to school, the question is, can you get the money? Now, and surely the student will have more debt under this situation.
Minority enrollment in college is already off. Right. And educators feel that the reason is that we've been cutting back on these scholarships already.
I just reject the notion that black people and other minorities are any less interested in getting a good education, or their families are any less interested in having their children get an education than non-minorities.
Jim, I would agree with you on that. I think the minority students very much want to go to college, and other low-income students from non-minorities want to also. What I think you're doing, though, or what this administration is proposing, is to take away the opportunity from a very large segment of those low-income students, whatever their ethnic background is, so they won't have the opportunity to go to college. So we won't have the benefit of these educated young people, some of whom may have very bright brains 10 or 20 years from now, when we may very desperately need them.
Well, the administration is expanding remarkably. The research budgets at universities, the NSF budget will double in 5 years. We're going to obtain that kind of emphasis, but we're not cutting. I just don't agree with you.
Very quickly, John Brademas, final word. We're almost out of time. A final response. John Brademas.
I think that it's obvious from what Senator Stafford has said that the administration's attack on student assistance will not command the support of Republicans or Democrats, and I think that Jim Miller should have an Academy Award for the marvelous performance that he's putting on this morning.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you, Jim Miller, for having two people against you and for standing up. I do appreciate it. We will be back after this.
The 21st century is just around the corner.
What does that mean?
Well, by looking ahead, we can develop technology for today.
Let's rewind to the top. There.
The 21st century is just around the corner.
What does that mean?
Well, by looking ahead, we can develop technology for today.
So?
So when the future comes, we'll be ready.
I think we've got it. Good night.
Good night. Future comes, we'll be ready.
We're all getting ready for today's big playoffs, particularly between the New York Giants and the Washington Redskins. Last year's champions, the Chicago Bears, won't be going to the Super Bowl, as cartoonist Dick Loker of the Chicago Tribune points out. You got any idea what it's like to get hammered by Washington? Yeah, kinda. I'm Leslie Stahl. Have a good week.
This portion of Face the Nation was sponsored by the men and women of the General Motors Corporation. GM, mark of excellence.
When it's important, America turns to CBS News for objectivity, accuracy, reliability. Watch the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
This is CBS.
Intimate.
You're much more insecure when you're established.
Provocative.
I play the dumbest blonde in America, but that's not who I am.
And often surprising.
My comedy comes out of fear, just standing on stage and really having nothing to say.
Each week, take some time to listen to the stars as they speak candidly on Cover Story.
See this week's Cover Story, Sunday night at 11:30 on TV8.
A good meal. Most of us take it for granted. But for millions of Americans, it's something they seldom see. Fortunately, though, Second Harvest will help. Second Harvest is a national network of food banks dedicated to feeding hungry Americans. But it needs your support. So please, contact the Second Harvest member near you. After all, isn't America one place where no one should live in hunger?
A Des Moines man on a shoestring budget started a multicultural newspaper.